In the winter of 1903, federal investigators arrived at the Mountain View Healing Sanatorium, nestled deep in the Colorado Rockies, expecting to uncover medical malpractice. Instead, they stumbled upon a horrifying discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Hidden behind a false wall in the basement, they found a hand-carved crypt containing 84 human skeletons, each marked with a name date of arrival and a chilling final entry: ascended to heaven through divine healing. For over 2 decades, the Crawford family had run what they called a revolutionary Christian medical facility, promising miraculous cures for tuberculosis and other terminal diseases. Wealthy patients from across America had come to this isolated mountain retreat hoping for salvation, but none of them left alive. The disturbing truth the investigators uncovered was so chilling that the federal government sealed the case files for 30 years, and the local community agreed to never speak of what had occurred at Mountain View again. This isn't just another tale of medical fraud or religious exploitation. This is the story of one of the most calculated, systematic killing schemes ever carried out, all under the guise of divine healing. Before we dive into the terrifying details of how the Crawford family turned faith into a weapon of mass murder, hit that subscribe button if you're brave enough to hear stories most channels would never dare tell. Leave a comment below to let me know where you're listening from, because this could have happened anywhere. Desperate people sought miracles. Only true mystery seekers can handle what's about to be uncovered. To understand how 84 souls met their grim fate in those mountains, we must go back to the fall of 1882, when the first patient arrived at what would become Colorado's most deadly secret. Back then, Elkhorn County was little more than a cluster of mining camps and ranch outposts. It was here that Dr. William Crawford arrived in September of 1882. At 34, Crawford was already an accomplished man. He was a Harvard Medical School graduate, a former Union Army surgeon, and a published researcher in what he called faith-based therapeutic medicine. He brought with him letters of recommendation from prominent physicians in Boston and New York, along with a vision that he claimed would revolutionize the treatment of incurable diseases. Crawford wasn't alone. His sister Mary had devoted her life to nursing ministry after surviving tuberculosis, which doctors had declared terminal. At 29, Sister Mary had a gentle demeanor, but possessed an iron will and unwavering belief that God spoke directly to her about patient care. Their cousin, Reverend James Crawford, was a charismatic preacher expelled from 2 different Presbyterian congregations for what church leaders deemed theological irregularities. James's booming voice and powerful presence drew suffering souls to him like moths to a flame. They chose a dramatic and isolated location for their sanatorium, perched 8,000 feet above sea level. The site offered panoramic views of snow-capped peaks that seemed to touch the heavens. The nearest town, Elkhorn, was a full day's ride down treacherous mountain trails, accessible only by a single wagon road that was impassable for months during harsh winters. Crawford declared that this was the perfect place for patients to connect with the divine while receiving the most advanced medical care. Construction of the Mountain View Wellington Sanatorium began immediately, funded by what Crawford claimed was a substantial inheritance from a deceased uncle in Massachusetts. The building was imposing, a 3-story structure made of local timber and stone, designed to house 30 patients. Each room had an unobstructed view of the surrounding mountains. Adjacent to the main building was a separate chapel with a bell tower visible from the valley below. Most mysteriously, Crawford had workers carve meditation chambers into the granite mountainside, connected to the main building by a secretive tunnel system. Mountain View's isolation, though a selling point, had darker implications. The sanatorium had no direct postal service. All mail was collected from Elhorn and brought up the mountain by Crawford's private courier. Though telegraph lines had been installed, the single wire was controlled entirely by the sanatorium. The nearest law enforcement was the county sheriff in Elhorn, Frank Jameson, who was generously compensated by the Crawfords to maintain confidentiality. By spring of 1883, the Mountain View Healing Sanatorium was ready for its first patients. The Crawfords had spent months crafting their reputation advertising in newspapers across the East Coast and Midwest. Their message was clear: traditional medicine had failed, but faith-based healing could succeed. They claimed to have developed a revolutionary treatment combining modern medicine with divine intervention. Testimonials from grateful patients filled their promotional materials. However, these patients could never be contacted directly, as they had all, according to the Crawfords, requested privacy during their spiritual journey. The first patient to arrive was Margaret Thornton, a 42-year-old widow from Philadelphia, whose tuberculosis had been deemed terminal by 3 different doctors. She arrived at Mountain View with a small fortune in gold coins and government bonds, hoping the mountain air and Christian healing might grant her the miracle medicine had failed to provide. On May 15, 1883, Margaret's carriage vanished into the mountain mist, carrying her toward what she believed would be salvation. She was never seen alive again. The morning of May 16, 1883, dawned clear and crisp at Mountain View, and Margaret had spent her first night in the so-called orientation chamber, a room where new patients were encouraged to cleanse their spirits. She had written in her journal later, found by investigators, that she felt more hopeful than she had in months, surrounded by devoted Christian souls. The daily routine followed the divine schedule created by the Crawfords. Patients rose at dawn for meditation, followed by a communal breakfast, where Dr. Crawford would deliver therapeutic sermons, combining medical jargon with religious fervor. After breakfast, patients attended group prayer sessions led by Reverend James. By the 3rd day, Margaret's transformation began. Dr. Crawford announced that she had been selected for an accelerated healing protocol, a great honor only given to those whose faith could transcend earthly limitations. Margaret was moved to a private room in the basement, a sanctification chamber carved into the mountain. The room was dimly lit by a single oil lamp, the air thick with incense, and a sweet cloying scent later identified as chloroform. In the center of the room stood a medical examination table with leather restraints. Dr. Crawford's methodical protocol involved administering increasingly larger doses of morphine under the guise of divine pain relief. Sister Mary would read from Scripture, assuring the patient that their suffering was purifying their soul. When the morphine took effect, Reverend James would conduct the final prayer, where he would lay hands on the patient's head, declaring them ready for ascension. At the moment of death, Crawford would increase the morphine dose to lethal levels, and Sister Mary would continue her recitations. When the patient slipped into unconsciousness and died, Reverend James would raise his hands and proclaim, "Behold, another soul has been healed and called home to glory." Margaret Thornton's death occurred on the evening of May 19, 1883, 4 days after her arrival. According to the investigators, she had been given 340 milligrams of morphine, enough to kill 3 healthy adults. Her final words, recorded by Sister Mary, were, "I can see the light. I am healed at last." Whether Margaret truly spoke those words or whether they were fabricated would never be known. Her body was then carried through the tunnels to the crypt, where it would join the 83 other victims. Each corpse was carefully arranged and tagged with a metal plate marking their name, arrival, and ascension. Margaret became the first entry in a growing catalog of death. The Crawford family's scheme didn't end with Margaret's death. Within hours, Dr. Crawford sent a letter to Margaret's family, claiming she had experienced a miraculous healing and had decided to remain at Mountain View to help other patients. The letter, written on official Sanatorium letterhead, detailed Margaret's spiritual healing and contained forged legal documents about her estate, including powers of attorney and property transfers, all signed by Margaret, though she had been dead for hours. Her family, devastated by years of watching Margaret suffer, received the letter with mixed emotions, joy at her apparent miracle and confusion at the strange request for privacy. But the official documentation and Dr. Crawford's credentials lent credibility to the astonishing claim, hiding the gruesome truth behind the facade of divine healing. When Margaret's family attempted to send letters directly to her, they were told she was undergoing intensive spiritual preparation and could not receive correspondence. The family's modest attempts to visit were gently discouraged, with the Crawfords insisting that such visits might disrupt Margaret's delicate spiritual state and potentially reverse her miraculous healing. Within 6 months, Margaret Thornton's estate, valued at around $18,000 in gold, and property had been transferred entirely to the Mountain View Healing Sanatorium. Her family, believing their loved one was alive and devoted to serving God in the mountains, had no choice but to respect what they believed were her wishes. They had no way of knowing that Margaret had been dead for months, her body lying in a granite tomb, while the Crawfords used her money to expand their facility and attract new victims. The success of Margaret's case became the template for the next 20 years. The Crawfords had discovered that the combination of real medical credentials, religious authority, and geographic isolation created the perfect environment for systematic murder. More importantly, they had learned that families of terminally ill patients were so desperate for hope that they would believe almost any story that promised their loved one salvation. By the summer of 1884, Mountain View had earned a reputation across the American West as a place where miracles happened regularly. The story of Margaret Thornton's miraculous healing spread rapidly through the networks of families struggling with terminal illnesses. Dr. Crawford began receiving inquiries from as far away as California and New York. The sanatorium's guest book, a leather-bound ledger meticulously maintained by Crawford, showed a steady stream of wealthy patients seeking the divine healing that traditional medicine had failed to provide. The second victim was Theodore Bancroft, a railroad magnate from Chicago, whose lung condition had worsened despite the best medical care money could buy. Bancroft arrived at Mountain View in July 1884, bringing not only over $75,000 in gold and securities, but also a deep desire to live long enough to see his young grandson grow up. His wife had passed away 3 years earlier, and he convinced himself that his affliction was God's test of his faith, just as it had been for his wife. The Crawfords approached Bancroft more strategically than they had Margaret. They had learned from their first success that wealthy patients required elaborate attention to maintain the illusion of revolutionary medical care. Dr. Crawford spent hours with Bancroft, explaining his theories about the connection between spiritual wellness and physical health, showing charts and diagrams that appeared to be cutting-edge medical research, but were actually fabricated forgeries designed to support his faith-based healing claims. Sister Mary took special interest in Bancroft's emotional state, spending long evenings listening to his fears about death and his guilt over living a materialistic life. She guided him through what she called spiritual inventory sessions, where patients were encouraged to confess perceived sins that might be hindering divine healing. These sessions served a dual purpose. They not only provided psychological insight that helped the Crawfords manipulate their victims, but also revealed hidden assets or family secrets that could be exploited. Reverend James conducted special healing services for Bancroft, claiming to experience prophetic visions about his future. During elaborate ceremonies in the chapel, James would fall into trance-like states and deliver messages that he claimed were directly from God. These messages always contained similar elements. Bancroft's illness was a test of his faith. His healing was assured if he remained committed, and he was being prepared for a special mission that would require him to stay at Mountain View for an extended period. As Bancroft grew more isolated from his normal support systems and more dependent on the Crawfords' version of reality, Dr. Crawford suggested that his business interests were interfering with his healing. The railroad magnate, convinced of the sanctity of the Crawfords' teachings, began signing over control of his companies to trustees they recommended. When Sister Mary pointed out his attachment to material possessions as an obstacle to full spiritual surrender, Bancroft donated increasingly large sums to the facility's operations. Bancroft's ascension took place on September 23, 1884, following the same procedure that had been used with Margaret Thornton. The Crawfords carefully administered morphine doses over the course of a week, explaining that the increasing drowsiness was actually a sign of spiritual deepening. Sister Mary remained by his side, reading scripture and assuring him that his visions of deceased loved ones were evidence of his approaching reunion with God. Reverend James performed the final ceremony with even more theatrical flair, proclaiming that angels were descending to escort Bancroft's soul to heaven. The letter sent to Bancroft's family was a masterstroke of psychological manipulation. Dr. Crawford reported that Theodore had experienced not just physical healing, but a profound spiritual transformation. He had decided to stay at Mountain View as a healing minister, using his business expertise to help expand the facility's divine mission. The letter also included instructions regarding the management of his estate and a request for the family to respect Theodore's privacy during his sacred service. Bancroft's son, a successful lawyer in Chicago, was more skeptical than Margaret Thornton's family had been. He hired private investigators to look into Mountain View's mysterious healing claims. However, the investigators found exactly what the Crawfords wanted them to find: a legitimate medical facility, operated by credentialed professionals, complete with testimonials from satisfied patients and documentation of successful treatments. The isolation that made Mountain View perfect for murder also made it nearly impossible to investigate effectively. When the investigators attempted to visit the sanatorium, they were told that Theodore was undergoing intensive treatment and could not receive visitors. Dr. Crawford provided them with a letter allegedly written by Theodore himself, expressing his wish to remain undisturbed during his healing process. Sister Mary had meticulously forged Theodore's handwriting, creating a flawless replica of his signature from the extensive correspondence he had conducted during his stay. By the end of 1884, the Crawfords had accepted 7 more patients. Each death followed the same ritual psychological preparation: gradual morphine poisoning, theatrical spiritual ceremonies, and immediate notifications to families about miraculous healing and voluntary isolation. The underground crypt at Mountain View was growing larger, with new chambers carved into the granite to accommodate the growing collection of victims. In less than 2 years, the Crawfords had amassed over $300,000 from their murdered patients, equivalent to more than $8 million in today's money. They used this fortune to expand the facility, adding a second building with advanced healing chambers and hiring more staff members carefully chosen for their willingness to stay silent and accept generous compensation. The true brilliance of the Crawfords' operation lay not just in the systematic murders they carried out, but in how they had created a self-sustaining mythology that drew in new victims. Each successful healing story spread through networks of desperate families, further building the reputation of Mountain View as a place of miracles. As 1885 began, the Mountain View Healing Sanatorium had become a perfectly functioning death machine disguised as a medical facility, and protected by isolation, religious authority, and the desperate hopes of grieving families. The Crawfords had perfected their methods of psychological manipulation, financial exploitation, and systematic murder. But most chillingly, they had discovered that their crimes weren't just sustainable, they were incredibly profitable. The granite crypt beneath Mountain View continued to grow larger, filling with the bodies of people who had come seeking healing only to find death. What they didn't know was that their success was about to attract the attention of someone far more dangerous than any investigator or suspicious family member. Someone who had been watching their operations from the shadows, planning their own approach to Mountain View. In the spring of 1888, Dr. Samuel Richardson, a respected physician and specialist in pulmonary diseases, arrived at Mountain View, commissioned by the Boston Medical Society to investigate claims of miraculous cures. Richardson would prove to be the catalyst that brought the Crawfords' deadly enterprise to an end. Crawford proudly showcased the treatment room's laboratory and patient quarters, enthusiastically explaining his theories about the connection between faith and healing. He proudly displayed the chapel where Reverend James conducted healing services, the meditation chambers where patients underwent spiritual preparation, and the medical library where he claimed to conduct research on divine healing protocols. However, Dr. Richardson, with his keen eye for detail, quickly noticed inconsistencies that were overlooked by casual visitors. The medical equipment was outdated and minimal, far from what would be required to support the revolutionary treatments Crawford claimed to administer. The laboratory, while stocked with basic chemical supplies, lacked the advanced diagnostic tools that would be necessary for monitoring patients with serious illnesses. Despite Crawford's claims that the facility housed 30 patients, the sanatorium felt eerily quiet and empty. When Richardson asked to meet with some of the patients who had reportedly been treated successfully, Crawford explained that most had chosen to remain at Mountain View as healing ministers, but were currently involved in intensive spiritual retreats that required complete isolation. The few patients Richardson did observe appeared to be in the early stages of treatment, showing no signs of miraculous recovery. In fact, some were growing progressively sicker, which raised Richardson's suspicions further. Richardson's most significant discovery came when he examined the sanatorium's medical records. Crawford, eager to demonstrate his scientific approach to faith-based healing, enthusiastically showed Richardson the detailed patient files he believed supported his claims. But Richardson, trained to read between the lines, saw evidence of systematic murder in those records. He noticed that patient symptoms consistently worsened over time, contrary to the reported miraculous recoveries. He also observed the dangerously high levels of morphine administered to patients far beyond what would be medically justifiable for pain management. Most suspicious of all, he detected patterns in the handwriting of patient letters, suggesting that many had been forged. The tipping point came when Richardson requested to conduct independent medical examinations of patients who had allegedly been cured, unable to produce any living patients who could demonstrate miraculous recoveries. Dr. Crawford began making increasingly elaborate excuses. He claimed that divine healing was so fragile that an outside medical examination could reverse the process. He argued that the patient's spiritual states were so advanced that they could no longer tolerate contact with physicians who lacked the proper faith. Crawford even suggested that Richardson's scientific skepticism was creating negative spiritual energy that could disrupt the healing process. Richardson's suspicions grew clearer when he spoke to Mrs. Sarah Bennett, the facility's cook. Unlike the other staff members, Mrs. Bennett had not been briefed on the cover story and casually revealed the true nature of Mountain View's operations. She mentioned how much morphine was used at the facility for a healing center, remarked on how patients became more religious and detached from worldly concerns as their treatment progressed, and most damningly noted how many patients chose to remain permanently at the facility after being healed, never returning to their families. That evening, Richardson made a discovery that confirmed his worst fears. While exploring the facility's basement levels, he found the entrance to the secret tunnel system that connected to the granite caves. Following the tunnels, he found the carved chambers where the Crawfords conducted their murder rituals. Inside, he saw medical equipment used to administer lethal morphine doses, alongside religious paraphernalia meant to create the illusion of spiritual healing. Most horrifyingly, he found Sister Mary's detailed records of each patient's final moments, which revealed the true nature of their ascension to heaven. Richardson realized the urgency of his situation when he saw that the Crawfords were planning to murder him as well. His questions were becoming too specific. His observations too accurate, and his medical credentials too impressive to ignore. Dr. Crawford started suggesting that Richardson might benefit from the sanatorium's healing treatments, implying that his skeptical nature indicated spiritual illness that required attention. Sister Mary began preparing what she called special refreshments for Richardson's meals, and Reverend James conducted private prayer sessions to assess Richardson's spiritual readiness for advanced healing protocols. The crisis came to a head on Richardson's 5th night at Mountain View. After experiencing increasing drowsiness from his meals, Richardson realized he was being poisoned with morphine. That night, he pretended to drink the tea Sister Mary had brought him, secretly disposing of it, and stayed awake to observe the facility's nighttime activities. What he witnessed confirmed his worst fears. Through his bedroom window, Richardson saw Dr. Crawford and his assistants moving through the corridors, checking on patients and administering what appeared to be medical treatments. But Richardson, with his trained eye, recognized the signs of systematic murder in progress. He watched as they entered rooms of patients selected for accelerated healing, administering lethal doses of morphine while conducting religious ceremonies. He saw bodies being removed through the tunnel system and transported to the underground crypt where previous victims had been stored. The next morning, Richardson made his escape from Mountain View, using his knowledge of mountain trails to avoid the main road where the Crawfords would expect him to travel. He carried with him detailed notes about the facility's operations, copies of medical records that proved the systematic murders, and the grim knowledge that dozens of people had been murdered, while their families believed they were receiving miraculous healing. Richardson's journey down the treacherous mountain was long and dangerous, but his determination to expose the truth pushed him forward. He knew every hour of delay meant more innocent victims might arrive at Mountain View only to find death instead of healing. He also understood that the Crawfords would soon realize his escape and begin destroying evidence, possibly killing any remaining witnesses to their crimes. Once Richardson reached Elkhorn, he immediately contacted federal authorities, setting in motion the investigation that would eventually bring down the Mountain View Healing Sanatorium. But the Crawfords had prepared for this very possibility. They had contingency plans in place for when their operations were discovered, and they were ready to take even more horrifying actions than the murders they had already committed. The race between Richardson's investigation and the Crawfords' cover-up would decide not only whether justice would be served, but whether the full extent of their crimes would ever be revealed. The Mountain View Healing Sanatorium high above Elkhorn was about to become the site of its final and most terrifying chapter. Within hours of discovering Richardson's departure, the Crawfords' reaction revealed their true depravity. Instead of fleeing or attempting to cover their tracks, they made a decision that would haunt investigators for decades. They decided to eliminate all evidence of their crimes by murdering every remaining patient and staff member at the facility. This decision was made during an emergency meeting in Dr. Crawford's private office, with Sister Mary and Reverend James present. Crawford discovered Richardson's discarded teacup and realized that their carefully planned murders had been uncovered. The medical records Richardson had examined were gone along with other documents that could provide proof of the systematic killings. But what terrified Crawford most was the realization that Richardson had the medical knowledge and professional credentials to expose their methods. The Crawfords knew they had to act fast to prevent their operations from being exposed, and they prepared to do anything necessary to silence all witnesses. Sister Mary, who had spent 6 years convincing herself that the murders were acts of divine mercy, finally revealed the full extent of her psychological deterioration. She proclaimed that Richardson's escape was part of God's plan, a test of their faith that required them to complete their sacred mission before earthly authorities could interfere. She claimed that she had received a divine vision instructing them to harvest the remaining souls before abandoning their earthly work. Her religious delusions had become so complete that she genuinely believed murder was a form of salvation. Reverend James, whose theatrical spirituality had always masked a calculating ruthlessness, saw the situation through a more pragmatic lens. The Crawfords had accumulated over $800,000 from their murdered patients. But this wealth would be meaningless if they were captured and executed for their crimes. The remaining patients at Mountain View represented both potential witnesses and additional sources of income that could fund their escape. James's plan was characteristically brutal. Kill everyone at the facility, destroy all evidence, and vanish with their wealth before authorities could arrive. The final harvest, as the Crawfords came to call it, began that very evening. The facility housed 12 patients in various stages of treatment, along with 6 staff members complicit in the murders. The plan was to eliminate all 18 people over the course of a single night, making their deaths appear to be the result of a tragic accident or natural disaster that would explain the disappearance of everyone at Mountain View. The method they chose was both efficient and horrifying. Dr. Crawford had access to chloroform in quantities sufficient to kill dozens, and the facility's isolated location ensured that screams would not be heard by anyone who might provide rescue. The plan was to systematically gas each room, beginning with the staff quarters and moving through the patient areas, ensuring no one would survive to tell authorities what had really happened. Mrs. Sarah Bennett, the cook who had inadvertently provided Richardson with crucial information, was the first to die. Sister Mary entered her room shortly after midnight, ostensibly to check on her health, but actually to administer a chloroform-soaked cloth that rendered her unconscious within minutes. As Mrs. Bennett struggled weakly against the suffocating chemical, Sister Mary whispered prayers over her, convinced she was providing spiritual comfort during the transition to death. The cook's body was immediately moved to the underground crypt, where it joined the dozens of previous victims. The systematic murder of the staff continued throughout the early morning hours. Dr. Blake, the assistant physician who had participated in numerous patient killings, was eliminated in his sleep by Dr. Crawford. Nurse Hartwell, who had administered countless lethal morphine doses, was killed by Reverend James using a combination of chloroform and manual strangulation. The facility's maintenance workers, groundskeepers, and administrative staff were murdered one by one, their bodies disposed of in the ever-expanding granite crypt. The patient murders followed the same ritualistic attention to detail that had characterized the Crawfords' operations throughout their 6 years of killing. Each patient was approached individually, with Sister Mary providing religious comfort, while Dr. Crawford administered fatal doses of morphine and chloroform. Reverend James performed abbreviated versions of his ascension ceremonies, proclaiming that each soul was being called home to glory. The patients, already weakened by their genuine illnesses and months of gradual poisoning, offered little resistance. Among the final victims was Elizabeth Hartwell, a 63-year-old woman from Denver, whose lung condition had brought her to Mountain View 3 months earlier. Elizabeth had written regularly to her daughter, describing the wonderful care and spiritual growth she was experiencing. Her letters, all forged by Sister Mary, had convinced her family that she was finally finding peace after years of suffering. Elizabeth's actual death was neither peaceful nor spiritual. She died alone in her room, murdered by people she trusted, while her family believed she was receiving miraculous healing. The youngest victim of the final harvest was Timothy Morrison, a 17-year-old boy whose parents had brought him to Mountain View as a last resort after traditional medicine had failed to cure his tuberculosis. Timothy had shown signs of improvement during his first weeks at the facility, leading his parents to believe the divine healing might actually be working. In reality, his improvement was the result of the mountain air and rest. And Dr. Crawford had been gradually increasing his morphine doses in preparation for his eventual murder. Timothy's death was particularly brutal. He regained consciousness during the chloroform administration and fought desperately against his killers before finally succumbing. The murders continued until dawn, when the Mountain View Healing Sanatorium had been transformed into a charnel house containing the bodies of 18 people. The Crawfords spent the following day systematically destroying evidence of their crimes, burning medical records, patient correspondence, and financial documents. They dismantled the laboratory equipment, removed religious artifacts from the chapel, and prepared to abandon the facility that had been their base of operations for 6 years of systematic murder. However, their escape plan contained a fatal flaw that would ultimately lead to their capture and the discovery of their crimes. The Crawfords had become so confident in their ability to manipulate and kill that they had grown careless in covering their tracks. More importantly, they had underestimated both the determination of Dr. Richardson and the efficiency of federal law enforcement when presented with credible evidence of mass murder. Dr. Richardson's arrival in Denver on June 15, 1888, marked the beginning of the most intensive criminal investigation in Colorado Territory's history. Richardson had ridden nearly 60 miles through treacherous mountain terrain, carrying evidence that would expose the most systematic killing operation ever discovered in the American West. His first stop was the federal marshal's office, where he presented Deputy Marshal Thomas Garrison with medical records, patient files, and detailed observations that painted a horrifying picture of the Mountain View Healing Sanatorium. Marshal Garrison was initially skeptical of Richardson's claims. The idea that a legitimate medical facility operated by credentialed professionals could be systematically murdering patients seemed too incredible to believe. However, Richardson's reputation as a respected physician and his detailed knowledge of medical procedures lent credibility to his accusations. More importantly, Richardson had brought with him physical evidence to support his claims. Morphine vials with suspicious markings, patient records showing impossible cure rates, and handwriting samples that suggested widespread forgery. The federal investigation began immediately, with Garrison organizing a team of 12 marshals to accompany him to Mountain View. The team included medical examiners, handwriting experts, and experienced criminal investigators who could analyze the evidence that Richardson had described. They also brought arrest warrants for the 3 Crawfords based on Richardson's sworn testimony about the murders he had witnessed. But when the federal team arrived at Mountain View on June 18th, they found something far worse than Richardson had described. The sanatorium appeared to be completely abandoned, with no signs of the patients or staff who should have been present at a functioning medical facility. The buildings were empty, with furniture covered by sheets and medical equipment removed or destroyed. Most ominously, there were signs of recent fires in several areas, suggesting someone had been systematically destroying evidence. The discovery of the underground crypt system revealed the true scope of the Crawfords' crimes. Following the tunnel system that Richardson had described, investigators found the carved granite chambers that had served as both murder rooms and storage areas for victims' bodies. The crypt contained exactly 84 human skeletons, each carefully tagged with metal plates bearing names and dates. The organization was meticulous. Bodies were arranged chronologically by date of death, with detailed records showing the progression of the murders over 6 years. The investigation of the crypt revealed evidence that would haunt the federal marshals for the rest of their lives. Many of the skeletons showed signs of violence beyond simple poisoning broken bones that suggested struggles, skull fractures indicating beatings, and restraint marks proving that victims had been tied down during their murders. The most recent bodies, those killed during the final harvest, still showed traces of the chloroform used to kill them. The entire crypt reeked of death and decay, with the sweet smell of decomposition mixing with the chemical odor of embalming fluids and medical preservatives. The paper trail investigators discovered in the partially destroyed records told an even more disturbing story. The Crawfords had kept detailed financial records showing they had accumulated over $1.2 million from their murdered patients. They maintained careful logs of morphine purchases, chloroform acquisitions, and body disposal procedures. Most chilling were Sister Mary's spiritual journals, which revealed her complete psychological breakdown and her genuine belief that she was performing acts of divine mercy by murdering suffering patients. The hunt for the fleeing Crawfords became a nationwide manhunt, with federal marshals coordinating with local law enforcement across Western territories. The Crawfords had a significant head start. They had fled Mountain View, immediately after completing the final harvest, taking with them a substantial portion of their accumulated wealth. However, their distinctive appearance and the notoriety of their crimes made them difficult to hide, and witness reports began coming in from towns across Colorado, Utah, and Nevada. The breakthrough in the investigation came from an unexpected source, James Palmer, a former patient at Mountain View who had escaped before his scheduled murder came forward when news of the investigation became public. His testimony would be the final piece in the puzzle leading authorities to the Crawfords' ultimate capture. James Palmer had been treated at Mountain View in early 1887 for a lung condition. But as other patients began disappearing under mysterious circumstances, he grew increasingly suspicious. Determined to escape, he bribed a maintenance worker to help him fake his death and fled under cover of darkness. Palmer's testimony would become crucial to the federal investigation, providing essential details about the Crawfords' methods and motivations. He described how the Crawfords manipulated patients psychologically to gain control over them, gradually increasing morphine doses before each murder and conducting elaborate religious ceremonies to accompany the killings. Palmer also provided key information about the Crawfords' escape plans, including safe houses and contacts they had established for emergencies. His insight was invaluable. But the federal investigation uncovered something even darker: the extent of official corruption that had allowed the Crawfords to operate undetected for so long. Sheriff Frank Jameson of Elkhorn, who had been receiving regular payments from the Crawfords, was one of the key figures involved in this network of corruption. He had turned a blind eye to suspicious activities at Mountain View and actively discouraged outside investigation. Local postal workers were bribed to intercept patient mail and forward forged correspondences to families, perpetuating the lie that their loved ones were still alive and well. Even the telegraph operator had been part of the conspiracy, helping to maintain the illusion of healthy patients, when in reality they had already been murdered. The corruption investigation revealed that the Crawfords had spent nearly $50,000 over 6 years to maintain their network of accomplices and informants. They systematically identified key officials whose cooperation was necessary for their operation and either bribed or intimidated them into compliance. The scope of their influence extended far beyond Elkhorn County, including officials in Denver and other major cities who had helped them maintain their medical credentials and professional reputation. As the federal investigation intensified, witnesses began to come forward with information about suspicious activities they had observed over the years. Local merchants reported unusual purchases of medical supplies and chemicals by Mountain View staff. Postal workers described the large volume of mail arriving at the facility, yet very little ever left the mountain. Families of patients who had supposedly experienced miraculous healing began to question the stories they had been told about their loved ones' voluntary isolation. The psychological profile developed by investigators revealed the dark personalities of the Crawford trio, whose complementary yet distinct traits had formed the perfect killing machine. Dr. William Crawford was identified as a narcissistic psychopath who saw others as tools to be manipulated for his own benefit. His medical training gave him the knowledge necessary to kill efficiently, and his charisma allowed him to gain the trust of vulnerable patients and their families. Sister Mary Crawford's profile was even more complex and disturbing. Investigators determined that she had suffered a complete psychological break following her recovery from tuberculosis, developing a messianic complex that convinced her she had been chosen by God to help suffering souls transition to heaven. Her detailed journals revealed a mind that had rationalized mass murder as divine mercy, using elaborate theological justifications for each killing. She genuinely believed she was saving her victims from earthly suffering by sending them to eternal paradise. Reverend James Crawford emerged as perhaps the most calculating of the three. Unlike his cousins, who had convinced themselves that their actions were justified by medical necessity or divine calling, James appeared to have been motivated purely by greed and power. His religious authority provided the spiritual framework for the others, and his theatrical skills were key in creating elaborate ceremonies that disguised systematic killing as divine healing. The federal manhunt eventually tracked the Crawfords to a small mining town in Nevada, where they had been attempting to establish a new identity and begin a similar operation. Federal marshals had been watching the trio for several days when they attempted to purchase a large quantity of morphine from a local pharmacy. The arrest was swift and decisive. All three Crawfords were taken into custody without resistance, apparently exhausted by months of running, yet confident that their crimes could never be fully proven. The trial of the Crawford conspirators began in Denver in September 1888. Drawing national attention as the first case of systematic medical murder to be prosecuted in American courts. The federal prosecutor, District Attorney Marcus Webb, faced the difficult challenge of proving that the Crawfords had committed murder, and that they had done so as part of a deliberate and systematic scheme to defraud and kill their patients. Though the evidence was overwhelming, the legal precedents for prosecuting such crimes were limited, and the defense team attempted to argue that the deaths had been the result of medical malpractice rather than intentional murder. The prosecution's case relied on three key elements: the physical evidence found at Mountain View, the testimony of survivors like James Palmer, and the detailed records the Crawfords had kept of their operations. Dr. Richardson served as the primary expert witness, explaining to the jury how the medical procedures described in the sanatorium's records could only have been intended to cause death rather than healing. The morphine dosages, chloroform applications, and systematic progression of treatments all pointed to deliberate murder disguised as medical care. The most damaging evidence came from Sister Mary's own spiritual journals. Her writings provided a detailed record of her psychological state and beliefs about the murders she had committed. Passages described how she felt God's presence during the murders and her certainty that she was helping souls achieve salvation. These journals provided prosecutors with clear evidence of premeditation and intent, solidifying the case against the Crawfords. The trial was a media sensation, with the prosecution's case serving as a chilling example of how greed and delusion can combine to form a deadly enterprise. As the Crawfords were convicted and sentenced, the public's horror grew, and the legacy of their crimes would be remembered as one of the most disturbing chapters in American criminal history. The defense strategy aimed to portray the Crawfords as deluded religious fanatics who genuinely believed they were helping their patients. Defense attorneys argued that Sister Mary's evident mental illness had influenced both her brother and cousin, creating a shared delusion that made them believe their actions were spiritually justified. They claimed that the morphine deaths had been intended as mercy killings for terminally ill patients, with the financial fraud being a secondary concern, rather than the primary motive. However, this defense strategy collapsed when prosecutors presented the Crawfords' elaborate financial planning and the systematic way they targeted wealthy patients. The detailed records of patient assets, the forged legal documents transferring property to the sanatorium, and the careful cultivation of victim families all pointed to a scheme motivated by greed rather than religious delusion. The final harvest murders, which had included healthy staff members who posed no threat except as potential witnesses, further undermined any claim that the killings had been motivated by mercy. The testimony of James Palmer was crucial to the prosecution's case. Palmer had been a former patient at Mountain View who escaped the Crawfords' murder plot. His detailed account of life inside Mountain View, the psychological manipulation techniques used by the Crawfords, and his escape provided the jury with a clear picture of the systematic nature of the crimes. His testimony was especially compelling because he had no apparent motive to lie. He had escaped before being victimized and came forward voluntarily to assist the investigation. Dr. William Crawford's testimony in his own defense proved to be a disaster for the defense team. Under cross-examination, Crawford revealed himself to be an arrogant and manipulative individual who showed no remorse for his actions. He tried to justify the murders as necessary medical procedures, claiming that his patients had been suffering unnecessarily and that his methods had provided them with peaceful deaths. His complete lack of empathy and his obvious pride in his medical innovations convinced the jury that they were dealing with a calculating killer, not a deluded healer. Sister Mary's testimony was even more damaging to the defense. Her descriptions of the religious visions that had guided her actions, her certainty that she had been chosen by God to help souls transition to heaven, and her complete lack of understanding that she had committed crimes, revealed a level of psychological dysfunction that made her claims of divine guidance appear obviously delusional. Her insistence that the murders were acts of love and mercy, delivered with genuine conviction and religious fervor, horrified the jury and eliminated any possibility of sympathy for her mental state. Reverend James Crawford chose not to testify in his own defense, seemingly recognizing that his calculating approach to the murders would not garner jury sympathy. Instead, his attorneys tried to portray him as a minor participant who had been manipulated by his more dominant cousins. However, this strategy fell apart when the prosecution presented evidence of James's central role in recruiting victims, conducting the murder ceremonies, and managing the financial aspects of the scheme. District Attorney Marcus Webb's closing argument lasted nearly 4 hours and provided a comprehensive summary of the evidence against the Crawfords. Webb methodically demonstrated how each element of their operation, from the initial recruitment of patients to the final disposal of bodies, had been carefully planned and executed. He emphasized that the 84 murders were not crimes of passion or accidents of medical malpractice, but the result of a deliberate scheme to exploit and kill vulnerable people by using religious authority and medical credentials as a cover. The defense's closing argument attempted to generate sympathy for the defendants by emphasizing their religious backgrounds and apparent genuine belief in divine healing. They argued that the Crawfords had been motivated by misguided faith rather than criminal intent, and that their actions, while tragically mistaken, had been intended to help rather than harm their patients. However, this argument was undermined by the overwhelming evidence of financial motivation and the systematic nature of the killings. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for all 3 defendants. The speed of the verdict reflected both the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the jury's horror at the scope and systematic nature of the crimes. Each defendant was found guilty of 84 counts of first-degree murder, along with numerous counts of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. During the sentencing hearing, victims' families were given the opportunity to confront the Crawfords, a powerful moment that highlighted the human cost of their crimes. Margaret Thornton's sister described the years of hope and confusion her family had endured, believing Margaret was alive and serving God in the mountains, unaware that her body was decomposing in a granite tomb. Theodore Bancroft's son spoke about the investigation he had conducted and his growing realization that his father had been murdered rather than healed. Judge Harrison Matthews, who presided over the sentencing, called the Crawford case the most heinous and systematic abuse of trust ever perpetrated in American territory. He noted that the defendants had exploited not only the desperate hope of terminally ill patients, but also the religious faith of families who believed their loved ones had been miraculously healed. The systematic nature of the murders, combined with the elaborate deception used to cover them up, represented what Judge Matthews called a corruption of everything sacred in human society. The sentences reflected the unprecedented nature of the crimes. Dr. William Crawford was sentenced to death by hanging with the execution scheduled for December 15, 1888. Sister Mary Crawford was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the judge noting that her obvious mental illness made the death penalty inappropriate despite the severity of her crimes. Reverend James Crawford was also sentenced to death, with his execution scheduled for the same day as his cousins. The executions drew crowds from across Colorado territory, with thousands of people gathering in Denver to witness what newspapers called justice for the Mountain View massacres. The Crawfords' legacy, marked by greed, deception, and systematic murder, would forever haunt the history of American crime, reminding the nation of the dangerous intersection of authority manipulation and unchecked power. Dr. William Crawford maintained his arrogance until the very end, delivering a final statement in which he claimed that history would vindicate his medical innovations and that future generations would understand the mercy he had provided to his suffering patients. Reverend James Crawford, not one to miss an opportunity to manipulate an audience, used his final moments to deliver a theatrical sermon about divine forgiveness, continuing to try and influence his listeners, even as he faced death. Sister Mary Crawford, however, was sentenced to life imprisonment at the Colorado Territorial Women's Prison, where she continued to maintain detailed journals describing her religious visions and her certainty that she had been chosen for a divine mission. Prison records indicate that she never showed any understanding of her actions as criminal, instead spending her final years attempting to convert other inmates to her belief that death was a form of healing. She passed away in 1923, still convinced that she had been an instrument of God's mercy. The aftermath of the Mountain View Healing Sanatorium case extended far beyond the trial and execution of the Crawford murderers. The discovery of systematic killings, disguised as medical care, sent shockwaves through American society, raising fundamental questions about the regulation of medical practice and the protection of vulnerable patients. More immediately, the case sparked a nationwide investigation into similar facilities that claimed to provide miraculous healing for terminal illnesses. The federal investigation into Mountain View's operations revealed a network of corruption that extended throughout Colorado territory and beyond. Sheriff Frank Jameson was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for his role in enabling the murders. Numerous other officials faced prosecution for accepting bribes or failing to investigate suspicious activities. Postal workers and telegraph operators who had helped maintain the deception received lesser sentences, but their prosecution sent a clear message that official corruption would not be tolerated. The financial investigation into the Crawfords' operation revealed that they had accumulated wealth equivalent to over $30 million in today's currency. Most of this money had been stolen from their murdered patients, but significant amounts had also been invested in legitimate businesses and properties across the Western territories. The federal government initiated a complex process of asset recovery, attempting to return stolen wealth to the families of victims while compensating the communities affected by the Crawfords' crimes. The families of the 84 murdered patients faced the traumatic process of recovering and burying their loved ones' remains. The bodies found in the Mountain View crypt had been preserved by the dry mountain air and controlled temperature, allowing for identification in most cases. However, many families chose not to view the remains, preferring to remember their loved ones as they had been in life, rather than as victims of systematic murder. The psychological impact on the families was devastating and long-lasting. Many had spent years believing their loved ones were alive and well-serving God in the mountains and experiencing miraculous healing. The discovery that these same loved ones had actually been murdered within days or weeks of arriving at Mountain View created a form of traumatic grief with no precedent in American society. Several family members required long-term psychiatric care to deal with the overwhelming grief, guilt, and horror that resulted from learning the truth about their relative's fate. The Mountain View case also sparked a broader examination of religious healing practices and the regulation of facilities that claim to provide medical care. State and territorial governments began implementing licensing requirements for medical facilities, mandatory reporting procedures for patient deaths, and oversight mechanisms designed to prevent the kind of systematic abuse that had occurred at Mountain View. These regulatory changes created tensions with legitimate religious healing practices, raising complex questions about the relationship between faith and medicine. The abandoned Mountain View Healing Sanatorium became a source of continuing horror for the local community. The buildings, contaminated by years of systematic murder, were eventually burned to the ground by federal authorities in an attempt to eliminate the physical reminders of the crimes. However, the granite crypt system carved into the mountainside proved impossible to destroy completely, and local residents reported continuing disturbances in the area for decades after the facility's destruction. The site of the former sanatorium became known as Murder Mountain, and stories of supernatural activity began circulating within months of the facility's destruction. Travelers reported hearing screams and moans coming from the abandoned granite chambers, while others claimed to see lights moving through the ruins of the burned buildings. Whether these reports reflected genuine supernatural phenomena or simply the power of suggestion, fed by knowledge of the horrific crimes that had occurred there, they contributed to a lasting atmosphere of dread and horror surrounding the location. The professional medical community responded to the Mountain View case with a combination of horror and determination to prevent similar abuses. Medical schools began implementing stricter ethical training, while professional organizations developed oversight mechanisms designed to identify practitioners who might be abusing their positions of trust. The case became a standard study in medical ethics, illustrating the potential for abuse when medical authority is combined with religious manipulation and geographic isolation. The legal precedents established by the Crawford trial influenced criminal prosecution for decades, providing prosecutors with frameworks for addressing systematic abuse of professional authority and the exploitation of vulnerable populations. The case demonstrated that crimes committed under the guise of professional care could be prosecuted as premeditated murder, rather than malpractice, establishing important principles that would be applied to future cases involving medical abuse. Perhaps most significantly, the Mountain View case revealed the deadly potential that exists when legitimate authority figures, doctors, religious leaders, and medical professionals choose to exploit their positions of trust for personal gain. The Crawfords had been able to commit their crimes precisely because they possessed the credentials and authority that made people trust them with their lives. This realization led to fundamental changes in how American society approached the regulation and oversight of professional authority, particularly in contexts where vulnerable people might be exploited. The story of the Mountain View Healing Sanatorium serves as a permanent reminder of the importance of questioning authority, maintaining oversight of professional practice, and protecting vulnerable populations from exploitation. The 84 people who died in those Colorado mountains were not just victims of individual criminals, but casualties of a system that failed to protect them from systematic abuse disguised as care and healing. The final entry in the Mountain View case files, written by Marshal Thomas Garrison, captured the lasting impact of the investigation. In 20 years of law enforcement, I have never encountered a case that combined such systematic evil with such elaborate deception. The Crawford murderers did not simply kill their victims. They corrupted the very concepts of healing faith and mercy that should protect society's most vulnerable members. Their crimes represent not just individual evil, but a fundamental betrayal of everything that civilized society holds sacred. Today, the site of the Mountain View Healing Sanatorium remains unmarked and largely forgotten. Hidden in the Colorado Rockies, where snow covers the granite chambers that once housed the bodies of 84 murder victims. The official records of the case remain sealed in federal archives, accessible only to researchers who can demonstrate legitimate academic interest in the crimes. But the story of what happened in those mountains between 1883 and 1888 stands as one of the most chilling examples of systematic murder in American history. The families of the victims have long since passed away, taking with them the personal memories of loved ones who traveled to Colorado seeking healing and found only death. But their story continues to serve as a warning about the dangers that exist. When desperation meets deception, when faith becomes a weapon, and when the people we trust most with our lives choose to become our killers. What do you think about this horrifying chapter in American history? Could systematic murder on this scale happen again in our modern world? Or have we developed sufficient safeguards to prevent such atrocities? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story has left you as disturbed as it should, share it with someone who appreciates true historical mysteries. Don't forget to subscribe for more dark stories from America's hidden past. Because the shadows of history hold secrets that we ignore at our own peril. Until next time, remember that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones who wear the faces of healers, teachers, and protectors. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.